Can we help you, old-timer? Did you get lost on your way to the bingo hall? The words sliced through the afternoon heat like a blade. The young Marine corporal stood with his arms crossed, a smirk pulling at his lips as he stared down at the old man sitting quietly on the bench. Philip Lawson, 83 years old, didn't flinch. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the distant targets, shimmering in the heat waves rising from the packed earth of Range 7. Another Marine laughed. "I think Grandpa wandered off from the veterans' home, sir." Philip turned slowly, offering a patient smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm in the right place, son. I was hoping I might fire a few rounds while I wait. You want a rifle?" The corporal barked out a laugh. "Sir, these are M4 carbines, not museum pieces. You probably couldn't even lift one." They laughed at him, until the general saw that faded patch. Philip Lawson didn't look like much. His shoulders were slightly stooped from the weight of 8 decades. His hands, resting on his knees, showed the natural tremor of age, though beneath that tremor was a steadiness that most men would never possess. His civilian jacket was faded, the fabric worn soft from years of use. His trousers were plain, unremarkable. To the young Marines gathered at Range 7 that Tuesday afternoon, he was invisible. Worse than invisible, he was irrelevant. Range 7 wasn't just any firing line. It was where the United States Marine Corps forged its warriors, where young men and women transformed into the most lethal fighting force on Earth. The range stretched 500 yards into the distance, marked by steel targets that glinted under the relentless sun. The air smelled of gun oil, sweat, and the distinctive tang of spent brass. This was hallowed ground for Marines, a place of discipline, precision, and unshakable confidence. The Marines waiting their turn were a portrait of modern military might. They wore digital camouflage utilities, their bodies chiseled from months of brutal training. They carried M4 carbines equipped with advanced optics, laser designators, and accessories their grandfathers could never have imagined. They were the product of boot camp at Paris Island or San Diego, 13 weeks of hell that had broken lesser men. They had earned the title. They wore the eagle, globe, and anchor with fierce pride. They believed they were invincible. Philip understood that confidence. He had once possessed it himself a lifetime ago, in a jungle so far away it felt like another world entirely. "I think I could manage," Philip said quietly, his voice a low rumble beneath their sharp, youthful tones. The corporal's amusement began to curdle into something darker. Irritation. The old man wasn't playing his part. He was supposed to be flustered, confused, apologetic. This quiet dignity felt like a challenge, an affront to the natural order of the range, where rank and physical prowess were the only currencies that mattered. "Look, old-timer," the corporal said, stepping closer until his shadow fell across Philip's weathered face. "I don't know who you think you are or what reunion tour you think you're on, but this is an active live fire range. You're a civilian and you're a liability. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I have a visitor's pass," Philip said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. It was all arranged. Just then, heavy footsteps approached. Gunnery Sergeant Miller strode over, his face a mask of stern authority. He was the range safety officer, a man whose word was absolute law on this patch of desert dirt. His eyes, trained to spot the slightest infraction, narrowed on Philip with immediate suspicion. "What's the problem here, Corporal?" the gunny asked, his voice a gravelly roar that demanded instant obedience. "This gentleman is confused, Gunny," the corporal reported, snapping to parade. "Rest. He's claiming he's supposed to be here and wants to handle a weapon. I told him he needs to leave the premises immediately." Gunnery Sergeant Miller sized Philip up in a single dismissive glance. He saw the stooped shoulders, the wrinkled face, the slight tremor in the hand holding out a laminated visitor's pass. He didn't bother to take it or read it. "Corporal's right," the gunny said, his tone final and unyielding. "This area is off limits to civilians. We're conducting qualification drills. It's dangerous, and frankly, it's inappropriate. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Sir, it's time for you to go." Philip's hand, still holding the pass, retreated slowly. His gaze drifted past the gunnery sergeant, past the smirking Marines, to a flagpole in the distance where the stars and stripes fluttered against the stark blue sky. He had seen that flag in places most Americans would never know existed. He had seen it draped over coffins. He had fought for what it represented, for the very right of these young men to stand here in safety and dismiss him. "I assure you, Sergeant," Philip said, his voice still even and controlled, "I am not confused, and I am no stranger to a live fire environment." The gunny's patience, already worn thin by the heat and the repetitive nature of his duties, finally snapped. He was accustomed to instant obedience. This quiet, persistent old man was a disruption, a piece that didn't fit into his orderly world. "You're not hearing me, are you?" the gunny growled, stepping so close he was almost touching Philip. He jabbed a thick finger toward the old man's chest. "You are a civilian. You have no authority here. Your memories of the good old days don't grant you a pass to interfere with the training of United States Marines. Now get out before I have you escorted off this base." The circle of young Marines had tightened around them, their amusement morphing into morbid curiosity. They were watching a confrontation, a test of wills, and they were certain they knew how it would end. The old man would shuffle away in defeat, and it would become a funny story to tell in the barracks later that night. The gunnery sergeant's eyes fell upon a small, unassuming patch sewn onto Philip's worn jacket. It was faded, the threads frayed at the edges. The design was simple, almost crude, a stylized ghost superimposed over a map of a river delta. It looked like something picked up at a surplus store, meaningless military memorabilia. "What's this supposed to be?" the gunny sneered, reaching out and flicking the patch with his finger. "Your senior citizen's sharpshooter club?" The touch, though light, was a spark on dry tinder. For a fraction of a second, the world dissolved for Philip. The hot, dusty range vanished. The smell of gun oil and sweat was replaced by the thick, humid stench of mud and decay. The jungle at night, the Mekong Delta. 1968. He saw himself impossibly young, barely 20 years old, hunkered down in a waterlogged foxhole. The monsoon rain fell in sheets, turning the earth into soup. Across from him sat his best friend, Tommy Chen, from San Francisco, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette that kept getting soaked. They were Force Reconnaissance volunteers, part of something they had been told didn't officially exist. Project Chimera, 12 men. Ghost operations deep behind enemy lines. Philip saw his own young hands, mud-caked and trembling, stitching that same ghost patch onto Tommy's jacket by the light of a shielded flashlight. It was a covenant, a promise. They were about to step into a darkness from which only one of them would return. Weeks later, on a medevac helicopter thick with the smell of blood and aviation fuel, Tommy lay dying on a stretcher. His breathing was shallow, his eyes already losing their light. With his last ounce of strength, he ripped the ghost patch from his own jacket and pressed it into Philip's hand. "Don't let them forget us, Phil," he had whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Don't let them ever forget." And Philip had promised. He had promised. He blinked, and the memory receded, leaving a profound ache in its wake. He looked at the gunny's dismissive face, and for the first time, something hard and cold entered his pale blue eyes. "All right, that's it," the gunnery sergeant announced, his authority now fully engaged. "You're coming with me. We'll get base security down here and sort this out properly." He reached for Philip's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. The humiliation was now public and physical, but not everyone was enjoying the show. Standing near the administrative building, a civilian logistics manager named Henderson was walking to his car when he noticed the commotion. Henderson was a history buff, a man who spent his weekends volunteering at the base museum, poring over declassified documents and forgotten records. He saw the gunnery sergeant grabbing the old man. He saw the circle of young Marines. Then his eyes caught the visitor's pass still clutched in the old man's hand. Even from a distance, he could make out the name typed in bold letters. Lawson, Philip. Henderson's blood ran cold. That name. He knew that name. He had read it in dusty, declassified mission reports, in files so restricted he was only allowed to view them for minutes at a time. Stories that were the stuff of Marine Corps legend, impossible missions, unbelievable survival. The ghosts who tipped the balance of entire regions during the darkest days of Vietnam. He looked closer, squinting against the sun, and saw the faded, unfamiliar patch on the old man's jacket. He had seen a drawing of it once in a file marked Trident Priority. His hand shot to his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he found the number he needed. The direct line to Brigadier General Michael Davies. The line was picked up on the second ring. "Sir, this is Henderson in logistics," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you need to get down to range 7 right now." There was a pause. "What is it, Henderson? I'm in the middle of a briefing." "It's your 9 o'clock appointment, sir." Henderson took a deep breath. "It's Philip Lawson." Another pause, longer this time. "And sir, they're about to arrest him." Inside the stately headquarters building, Brigadier General Michael Davies froze. His hand tightened around the phone receiver until his knuckles turned white. "Say that name again," the general commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Lawson, Philip, Henderson repeated. Sir, he's at range 7 right now, and Gunnery Sergeant Miller is about to have him removed by force. Dear God, the general breathed. He spun toward his aide, who immediately snapped to attention. Captain, get my vehicle now. Full escort. I want to be at range 7 in 3 minutes. The captain, startled by the sheer urgency in the general's voice, scrambled toward the door. And Captain, Davies added, his voice grim and controlled, get on the line with the archives. I want the service record for Lawson Philip. First Force Reconnaissance, cross-reference with Project Chimera. Tell them it's a Trident priority. I want it on my tablet before we arrive. The mention of Project Chimera made the captain's face go pale. That name was a ghost, a legend whispered about only in the highest echelons of command, a clandestine unit from the Vietnam era whose operations were so deeply classified that most of their records were still sealed 50 years later. Back at Range 7, Gunnery Sergeant Miller was oblivious to the storm about to break over his head. His authority had been questioned, and now he was going to reassert it with finality. He tightened his grip on Philip's arm, preparing to march him toward the small administrative hut where base security could be summoned. All right, that's enough of this circus, he announced to the watching Marines. The show's over. He looked down at Philip, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. You brought this on yourself, old man. You come on to my range. You disrupt my training. You refuse a direct order. What did you think was going to happen? We can do this the easy way or the hard way. A nice quiet chat with the MPs, or we can make a scene, your choice. Philip said nothing. He simply stood there, his dignity an invisible shield that the sergeant's threats could not penetrate. This silence infuriated Miller even more. Last chance, Grandpa, he snarled. Start walking. It was then that a new sound reached them. It wasn't the familiar pop of rifle fire. It was a rising whine, the sound of engines moving at high speed, accompanied by the piercing wail of military escort sirens. Every head turned. Over the rise at the end of the service road, a convoy appeared. 2 black SUVs led the way, their lights flashing, followed by a command Humvee with a mounted antenna array. They weren't driving. They were flying, kicking up a massive plume of dust and gravel that rose like a sandstorm behind them. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Marines began to disembark, but they weren't in combat utilities. They were members of the general staff in their crisp service uniforms, moving with a disciplined urgency that electrified the air. The casual, mocking atmosphere on the range evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden, tense silence. Every young Marine snapped to attention, their eyes wide with confusion and alarm. Something was happening. Something big. The rear door of the Humvee opened, and out stepped Brigadier General Michael Davies. He was a tall, imposing man, his uniform immaculate, the single star on his collar glinting in the harsh sunlight. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made Gunnery Sergeant Miller's blood turn to ice. Miller instinctively released Philip's arm, stepping back as if he had been burned. General Davies didn't spare a glance for the gunnery sergeant or any of the other Marines frozen at attention. His eyes, laser-focused, found Philip Lawson standing alone in the center of the circle. He strode forward, his polished boots crunching on the gravel with each purposeful step, the sound like hammer blows in the profound silence. He stopped 3 feet in front of Philip. His eyes fell to the faded patch on the old veteran's jacket, and a flicker of profound recognition, of awe crossed the general's face. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through every assembled Marine, Brigadier General Michael Davies drew himself up to his full height, his back rigid, and executed the sharpest, most reverent salute of his entire career. Mr. Lawson, the general's voice boomed, clear and powerful, echoing across the silent range. It is an honor, sir. He held the salute, his arm locked, his eyes fixed on Philip with unwavering respect. The gunnery sergeant stood frozen, his mouth agape. The young Marines looked on, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. A general, their base commander, saluting this frail old man. Philip, his expression unchanged, slowly raised a hand and gave a slight, acknowledging nod. The general lowered his arm, then turned. His gaze swept over the petrified gunnery sergeant and the circle of young Marines. His face was pure fury. You, he said, his voice dangerously low, pointing directly at Miller. What is your name? Gunnery Sergeant Miller, sir, he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by sheer terror. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, the general repeated, the name dripping with scorn. Do you have any idea who this man is? Miller could only shake his head, speechless. No, the general said, his voice rising like thunder. Of course you don't. You stand here on ground that was paid for by the blood and sacrifice of men like him. You wear a uniform that he defined. You breathe air that he kept free, and you have the unmitigated gall to disrespect him. He took a step toward Miller, who visibly flinched. You see this patch? The general demanded, pointing to the faded emblem on Philip's jacket, the one Miller had mocked just minutes before. You thought it was a joke. Let me tell you what it is. This is the mark of the ghosts of the Mekong, Project Chimera. A gasp went through the few staff officers who recognized the name. In the darkest days of the war in Vietnam, the general's voice rang out like a history lesson delivered from on high. There was a unit so clandestine and it didn't officially exist. A 12-man team of volunteers from Force Reconnaissance. They were sent on missions that no one else could do or would do. They operated for weeks at a time behind enemy lines with no support, no radio contact, and no chance of rescue if they were compromised. They were hunters, ghosts who tipped the balance of the war in entire regions. Of the 12 men who wore that patch, only 2 came home. He turned back to Philip, his voice softening with reverence. You are looking at one of them. This is Philip Lawson, recipient of the Navy Cross for his actions at Khe Sanh. 3 silver stars, 5 purple hearts. The man credited with over 150 confirmed sniper kills, including 3 enemy generals. His records were sealed for 50 years to protect the operations he was part of. He is not just a veteran, he is a living legend. The silence that followed was absolute. The young Marines stared at Philip, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and dawning reverence. They were looking at a ghost, a hero whose story had been deliberately erased from the history books they had studied. The old frail man they had laughed at was a giant. The general turned his wrath back to Gunnery Sergeant Miller. You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. You and every Marine who stood here and participated in this disgraceful spectacle. You are all being assigned to a month-long remedial course on Marine Corps history, and you will personally write a 2,000-word essay on the history of Force Reconnaissance in Vietnam. But first, you will stand here, and you will apologize to this man. Miller, his face pale and slick with sweat, turned to Philip. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Mr. Lawson, sure, I am so sorry. I had no idea. My conduct was unacceptable. There is no excuse. The other Marines, one by one, mumbled their own ashamed apologies, their voices barely audible. Philip finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than the general's roar. He looked not at the shamed gunnery sergeant, but at the young Marines, their faces now full of humility. It's all right, son, he said to Miller, his tone gentle, without a trace of anger. He then addressed the group. The uniform doesn't make the man makes the uniform. You wear it with pride, but that pride should be rooted in humility, in the memory of those who wore it before you. Respect isn't about who's the loudest or the strongest. It's about recognizing the dignity in everyone. Remember that. General Davies cleared his throat, his own eyes misty. Mr. Lawson, he said, his voice full of warmth, I believe you came here to fire a few rounds. The range is yours. Which rifle would you like? Philip offered a small, genuine smile. He walked to the rifle rack, past the specialized long-range sniper systems, and picked up a standard-issue M4 carbine, the same model the young Marines had been using. He walked to the firing line, the weapon feeling light and familiar in his hands, an extension of his body. He didn't bother with the bench or the sandbags. He simply stood, raised the rifle to his shoulder in one fluid motion, and fired. 10 rounds in a slow, steady rhythm. The young Marines watched, mesmerized. Through the spotting scope, they could see the result. 10 rounds, all within the center ring of the target 500 yards away, grouped so tightly they could be covered with the palm of a hand. It wasn't flashy. It was economical, precise, and perfect. It was mastery. In the weeks that followed, a formal letter of apology from the base was printed in the local paper. Gunnery Sergeant Miller and his men attended their history course, where they listened to lectures from decorated veterans who told them stories that made their own training seem like child's play. The incident became a quiet, powerful lesson that rippled through the entire base. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Miller was at the base commissary. He saw Philip Lawson sitting alone at a small table, slowly drinking a cup of coffee. His heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath and walked over. Mr. Lawson, sir. Philip looked up, his blue eyes recognizing him immediately. He gestured to the empty chair. Gunnery Sergeant, please sit. Miller sat down, his hands trembling slightly. Sir, I just wanted to apologize again, in person. What we did, it was a failure of everything a Marine is supposed to be. Philip took a sip of his coffee. You were young, he said simply, and you made a mistake. The important thing is what you do after the mistake. It seems to me you're learning. They sat in silence for a moment, the chatter of the commissary around them. Sir, Miller said finally, his voice barely a whisper, could you tell me about them? The ghosts? Philip looked out the window, a distant look in his eyes. A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. I can, he said. I can. And as the old hero began to speak, the young Marine leaned in, ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to remember. If this journey of honor and respect moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to BR Revenge Stories for more tales of courage and sacrifice. Thank you for watching.